In 1947, Arnold Schoenberg wrote an essay entitled Brahms the Progressive, in which he reopens the Wagner-Brahms controversy of the 1880s by demonstrating that Brahms, previously regarded by the musical public as a staid preserver of the Viennese traditional classicism, should be assessed for, quote, how great an innovator Brahms was in respect to harmony. Schoenberg gives numerous musical examples of Brahms's music in his essay, which, quote, compete successfully with that of any Wagnerian passage. In these examples of Brahms's progressivism, Schoenberg was in fact writing about himself, between the lines, in that he saw his own method of composing with 12 tones as an organic unit within the Viennese tradition, not a destruction of that tradition as his critics, sometimes anti-Semitic critics, have had it. In other words, if Brahms could be a progressive, then Schoenberg could be a conservative. This reverse argument was given a full hearing by Schoenberg's disciple, Dika Newlin, in her 1947 book, Bruckner-Mahler-Schoenberg. She compares Schoenberg's creative output to the mixture of, quote, elements of convention and revolt in the same faction or even in the same individual that generally characterized the final decades of the Habsburg Empire. Newlin selected the music theorist Simon Zechter, 1788-1867, the now forgotten teacher at the Vienna Conservatory, who taught students as diverse as Schubert, Bruckner, who would succeed him at the conservatory, Thalberg, and the poet Grillparzer, as the demonstrative thread from Schoenberg back to the classical Vienna of Haydn Mozart. Zechter, composer of over 8,000 musical works, including daily fugues, was so academically conventional that even the polyphonic techniques of Baroque music found in Johann Joseph Fuchs, 1660-1741, were still the foundation of composing music. Fuchs was the vice Kapellmeister at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna and later the principal court Kapellmeister. Anton Bruckner, 1824-1896, began life in the Austrian provinces, serving for a while as assistant school teacher in Windhag, where amongst his duties was included the hauling of manure. But the great Augustinian monastery of St. Florian was nearby, where he heard organ, choirs, set in the interior of a grand Baroque church with impressive services. This musical stimulation slowly led Bruckner to approach Zechter for lessons in music theory, which first brought Bruckner to Vienna in 1855. He then succeeded Zechter in 1867 on the latter's death. These two primary influences on Bruckner's creativity, the liturgy of the St. Florian monastery and the Viennese classicism of Zechter's music theory, would seem to set him apart from the origins of Schoenberg's innovation in tonality, some would say atonality. But it is in fact Newlin's point that there is a lineage from Fuchs to Zechter, to Bruckner to Schoenberg. For Bruckner, religious faith was uncritical, almost naive, and the basis of all creative work. For a composer like Bruckner, a work on a liturgical or biblical text was not about the activities of God, who, for Bruckner, was even more remote than the Habsburg monarchs, but rather it was about the composer's faith in God. In the musical vocabulary of classical Vienna, this meant the trumpets, the timpani, and the longer performance durations of the masses of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. This tendency to the large also became characteristic of much of the 19th century, as in architecture, novels and poems, long sermons and political speeches, huge choirs to sing Handel's Messiah and Berlioz's Requiem, and then there are also panoramic paintings, to name a few examples. This concern with size, length, and breadth continued through Bruckner into Gustav Mahler's 9 symphonies, each a world unto itself, as Mahler said. And Schoenberg's early works also, including Verklärte Nacht, in English Transfigured Night, a string sextet of 1899, and the Götterlieder, the Songs of Götter, for solo voice, choir, a huge orchestra, begun in 1900 and finally completed in 1911. Yet already in the 1860s, a reaction to the vogue of the gigantic in music had set in. This new musical vogue, a part of the neo-medievalism that arose in the 19th century arts, as for example the Tractarian movement at Oxford. And it began perhaps with a book by about Palestrina, published at Rome in 1828. Its Italian title is Memorie Storico-Critiche della Vita e delle Opere di Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, a biography of the 16th century Vatican composer. Vianney's book has, according to his biographer in The New Grove, many failings in historical and philological method, and there are inaccuracies of fact. a problem which, combined with Vianney's own pro-Catholic conservatism in both the ecclesiastical and political realms, rendered him unable to, quoting the New Grove again, understand the music of his own time, particularly instrumental music, to which he was strongly averse. Nonetheless, a segment of the 19th century musical Europe was ready for Vianney's portrayal of Palestrina, for a vogue of Palestrinianism emerged, a forerunner of the Cecilian Verein, or St. Cecilia movement, founded by Franz Xavier Witt in 1867 and named for the patron saint of music. Anton Zeidler, a Cecilianist, wrote these lines in 1900. Away with the instrumental masses of the Viennese school. It is really a shame that even such illumined spirits as Haydn and Mozart were led astray into a blind alley of weakened, denatured church music. There are two ways to respond to the dichotomy between the expansive church music of Haydn, Mozart, Bruckner, and the more intimate a cappella music of Palestrina. One response, the one taken by Newlin, is to discredit the Cecilian movement as being the misguided result of Vianney's misinformed biography. But another response to the agenda of the Cecilians, which I wish to pursue, is that despite its factual problems about Palestrina, the Cecilian movement was part of, and also reflective of, a larger movement, one that was moving from the gigantic to the intimate, from overwhelming fashion and vogue to remnants of ancient tradition recently rediscovered, and also from deism to theism. A musical example of the search to recover the lost tradition of the 19th century is the 19th century effort by French and German Catholic scholars to recover medieval chant and choral music and publish it in critical editions. They also sought to reestablish an authentic practice for singing this ancient music, an effort led by the Benedictine monastery at Salem. This lesser-known effect of the Cecilian movement amounted to its participation in the trend of certain Catholic and Protestant communities to simpler, historically grounded worship. This trend reached at least one of its apexes in the search for the historical Jesus and the primitive church, led by Adolph Harnack, but we also know that there's a little booklet by Albert Schweitzer on the quest for the historical Jesus. In 6 lectures that Harnack gave, collected into his book Was ist Christentum, as we know it in English as What is Christianity, Harnack attempted a clean sweep, that's a quote from the English translation, of the heap of rubbish, another quote, that encased the Christian gospel subsequent to the time of Jesus of Nazareth. For Harnack, the essential true Christianity was the simple gospel preached by Jesus before the crucifixion, primarily in Galilee. This essential gospel had been, from the time of the apostles, smothered in a growing elaboration of preaching and writing about Jesus until by the High Middle Ages, orthodoxies and Catholicism's heap of rubbish, quoting again, was the dominant feature of Christianity. In a way reminiscent of the archaeologists of his day, digging in the sands of the Near East, Harnack thought the Galilean gospel could be recovered. In fact, Harnack held that a partial recovery was achieved by Luther. Harnack spent a large portion of What is Christianity on a list of themes in the Galilean preaching. These themes included John the Baptist's call to repentance as enlarged upon by Jesus, a coming conflict between the kingdom of heaven and Satan's kingdom of darkness, depicted in, quoting a biographer, dramatic pictures. Of closer relation to Schoenberg's musical aesthetics are Harnack's interest in the kingdom of heaven being not, quoting now, of angels and devils, thrones and principalities, but of God and the soul and God. For Harnack, the preaching of Jesus depicted a faith of individuals, a faith separated from the public worship of the day, removed to a sphere of love, and quoting Harnack again, always the love which serves, and Harnack had serves in italics. Withdrawing from the public worship of Jesus' Sadducees, Levites, and Pharisees, I think, may be compared to Cecilian withdrawing from the court music-inspired masses of Viennese classical composers, ranging from Haydn to Bruckner. Harnack's withdrawing included a simplification of Trinitarian theology and ecclesiastics unlike anything proposed by the Cecilians. In his lectures, the booklet, What is Christianity, he almost never mentions the Holy Spirit, always refers to Jesus as a conduit to the Father. Think, for example, the opening of the Lord's Prayer. And never uses the term Holy Trinity. In other words, little separates the preaching of Jesus from the milieu of Judaism in which it resounded with such startling effect. Harnack underscored this Judaic color of Galilean Christianity in a study of J. Rendell Harris's The Odes of Solomon, now first published from the Syriac version. This was published by Cambridge University Press in 1909. Harnack did a study and supervised a German translation of it for 1910 in the German series Texte Untersuchungen. Harnack's interest lies in the fact that this was a first-century Christian redaction of a Christian document. As such, it bridges the gap between the Galilean Christianity and its Judaic milieu. Harnack especially noticed the odes Individualismus in seiner Freiheit von allen Mystiken und Zeremoniersten und seiner spirituellen Reinheit. If I may offer in English, he was saying that these odes of Solomon, and a Christian source from Jewish origins, has an individualism in its freedom from all mysticism and its ceremonies, and also its spiritual purity. For Arnold Schoenberg, a Jew converting to Lutheranism just a year before Harnack's lectures of 1899, and then also Schoenberg, a composer, who wrote a chamber symphony for 15 instruments in 1906, and I might comment that at the time, chamber symphony was a contradiction of terms. For this Schoenberg, Harnack's basic goal of recovering a lost faith and restoring it to a simple, economical, clearly proclaimed state of spiritual purity may well have been appealing. Schoenberg was able to cite in an autobiographical essay of 1931 where his respect for and techniques in simple, short, economical musical techniques came from. From Bach, Schoenberg learned this: the art of producing everything from one thing, the art of relating figures, by which he means musical motives and ideas, by transformation. From Mozart, Schoenberg said he learned coordination of hieronymus characters to form a thematic unity. From Brahms, Schoenberg wished to cite economy yet richness. Earlier, in an essay published in Vienna in 1911, Schoenberg encouraged teachers of the arts to avoid, and these are three quotes here, pomposity, which is fraud, and not morality. Rather, wrote Schoenberg, a true teacher of art would have to guide his students toward this severe matter-of-factness, which, more than anything else, is the distinguishing mark of everything truly personal. This statement reflects Harnack's description of Jesus' preaching on the kingdom of heaven as, in my earlier quote again, God in the soul in God, with no rubbish heaps, quoting, to interfere. Harnack's hope that a simple economical church will free the soul to hear the word of God parallels Schoenberg's hope that a simple economical, matter-of-fact musical style will free the mind or soul of the musical composer for powerfully creative expression of a communion with God. This is a theistic view of musical composition, making composition akin to prophecy. From the various essays in the anthology Style and Idea, this was a book first published in 1950 and then reissued in a better enlarged version in 1978 of many of Schoenberg's essays, and it's essentially the source I'm drawing from here. From this anthology, the following quotes may be offered as examples of Schoenberg using religious terms to explain musical creativity, and I'll also identify some of these essays. This one is from 1946. My personal feeling is that music conveys a prophetic message, revealing a higher form of life toward which mankind evolves, and it is because of this message that music appeals to men of all races and cultures. An interesting essay in 1927 commenting on the rise of fascism in Italy and its effect on the composers there. Italian national music, which today is openly written on higher orders, parentheses, whereas I, in my reactionary way, stick to writing mine on orders from the Most High, close parentheses, ... Here's again the essay, one of his most famous, Brahms the Progressive, 1947. It does not matter whether an artist attains his highest achievements consciously or subconsciously. Our Lord is an extremely good chess player. He usually plans billions of moves ahead. He likes helping in their spiritual problems those he has selected. Here is a eulogy for Gustav Mahler, who died in 1911. Let it be remembered that the creative urge continues. The greatest works are conceived, carried through, and born, but the creator, meaning composer, who brings them forth, does not feel the bliss of generation. He feels himself merely the slave of a higher ordinance. under whose compulsion he ceaselessly does his work, quote, as if it had been dictated to me, Mahler once said, to describe how rapidly and half consciously he created in 2 months his 8th symphony, nicknamed the Symphony of the Thousand. And then an interesting manifesto style of essay from 1947 entitled Human Rights. Here are the final sentences from the essay. One must never give up the longing for the universal sanctity of human rights. In our soul there lies the power of longing with creative intensity. We have now seen that from about 1906 through the 1940s, Schoenberg was increasingly interested in simple, economic, human-scale forms in music. He was interested in a theistic God, the Most High, who is involved in the creative thought of composers and other artists. And Schoenberg is interested in how God's creative urge, and that's from Mahler's Eulogy, drives composers to write music not as a consciously crafted construction, but as a received prophetic revelation. We may now look closely at Schoenberg's concepts of what composing music is, simultaneously observing the interwoven musical techniques and expression of theological thought. In these same pivotal years of 1906 to 1909, Schoenberg and his two most seminal pupils, Anton von Webern, who died in 1945, and Alban Berg, 1885-1935, composed a series of works that would become the origin of the 12-tone method. Recalling in 1941 the works of this period 1906 to 1909, Schoenberg wrote, "The foremost characteristics of these pieces, in statu nascendi, in the state that they were being born in, were their extreme expressiveness and their extraordinary brevity. At that time, neither I nor my pupils were conscious of the reason for these features, which forced us to counterbalance extreme emotionality with extraordinary shortness. Thus, subconsciously, consequences were drawn from an innovation. The musical aspects of the foregoing are the brevity of the composition and the bold, well-delineated musical expression, a forerunner of the German expressionism that in the 1920s and 30s would be prominent in novels, paintings, and German and even American black and white motion pictures. The theological aspect is the identification of an inner force, giving life to the composer's creativity. Elsewhere, Schoenberg referred to the creativity as the idea, often with a capital I, and again, the discussion is often couched in language familiar to theologians. For Schoenberg, idea, in its broad sense, is prior to style, but both are present in an inspired composition. Musical style is the result of the composer's craft, and every composer, quote, has fingerprints of his own, his personality. Quite distinct from the handiwork consciously carried out is, quote, what seems to me the most important element in a work of art, the idea. I myself, Schoenberg continues, consider the totality of a piece as the idea which its creator wanted to present. Notice that Schoenberg still says the creator will present the idea, not create it or construct it. Schoenberg discusses idea in a tone of awe and mystery. After the preceding statements, Schoenberg gives an elaborate description of the genius behind the design of a pair of pliers. And I thought I'd even bring a pair to show you today, but imagine if I had a pair of pliers here. Noting that pliers are simple, functional, ingenious, and even though, quote, the tool itself may fall into disuse, the idea behind it can never become obsolete. Therein lies the difference between a mere style and a real idea. And now in italics, a real idea can never perish. For Schoenberg, the idea in the work of art comes from God. And here's what he says. What I believe, in fact, is that if one has done his duty with the utmost sincerity, has worked out everything as near to perfection as he is capable of doing, then the Almighty presents him with a gift, with additional features of beauty such as he never could have produced by his talents alone. The idea then comes to the composer who only receives it and may not even recognize it or understand it. The eulogy of the slave, quote-unquote, Mahler, and the eulogy above, illustrates this, and Schoenberg himself has related how he was a receptor. And a rather long quote here. Ever since 1906, I had started writing compositions which led to the abandonment of tonality. My next step in this direction occurred in 1917 when I started to compose the Jakobslieder, a work based on the story of Jacob's ladder. I contrived the plan to provide for unity, which was always my main motive. To build all the main themes of the whole oratorio from a row of 6 notes, C sharp, D, E, F, G, and A flat. These were probably the 6 notes with which the composition began. In 1944, I discovered to my greatest pleasure that this beginning was a real 12-tone composition. Before I wrote my first strict composition with 12 tones in 1921, I still had to pass through several stages. Schoenberg then did not invent the tone row in order to destroy tonality, nor, as one theologian wrote, I'm quoting now a theologian named Francis Schaeffer, had Schoenberg totally rejected the past tradition in music and invented the 12-tone row, in sharp contrast to Bach, who, on his biblical base, as a Christian, believed in that quote. Rather, Schoenberg, the method of composing with 12 tones grew out of necessity, end of that quote. A necessity imposed on Schoenberg by the musical ideas that emerged around 1906 and 1909, ideas that were seeking brevity and clear expression, not tone rows. The compactness of these works, by placing the various notes of the music in close proximity to each other, resulted in the dissonances that so shocked the late Romantic public. Said Schoenberg, "Let us not forget that I came to this gradually, as a result of a convincing development which enabled me to establish the law of the emancipation of the dissonance. Dissonances are natural and logical outgrowths of an organism, and this organism lives as vitally in its phrases, rhythms, motives, and melody as ever before." Thus far, Schoenberg has said for us that the idea of a musical composition is the most important feature, is received by the composer, who may be a half-conscious slave in writing it down, and that an idea is an imperishable gift from the Almighty. Schoenberg also said that the idea is something like this. A composer must not compose 2 or 8 or 16 measures today and again tomorrow and so on till the work seem to be finished, but should receive a composition as a totality in one single act of inspiration. Intoxicated by his idea, he should write down as much as he could, not caring for the little details. They could be added or carried out later. Schoenberg then is seeing music as vital, as a living organism. It comes to the composer's totality, not a note-for-note construction. This regard for the idea as an integral, generative organism allowed Schoenberg to give approbation even to George Gershwin, and he wrote this in the 30s about Gershwin. Gershwin's melodies are not products of a combination nor of a mechanical union, but they are units and therefore could not be taken to pieces. Melody, harmony, and rhythm are not welded together, but cast. We have now seen that Schoenberg's ideals of economy and individual expression in music have comparisons to theological ideas of Adolph Harnack. Schoenberg's concept of the musical idea as a living organism may be compared to one of the innovative theological concepts of Karl Barth. And first, some background for that. The concept of music or melody having inner meaning or divine influential powers is not original in Schoenberg. The Jewish tradition of divinely enlivened melodies goes back to the prophet Elisha, who in 2 Kings 3, verse 15, had to call for a minstrel in the King James, or a musician in other translations, especially the Jewish Publication Society's Tanakh, in order to prophesy. The verse reads this way: "And it came to pass, when the minstrel or musician played, that the hand of God came upon him." The implication is that Elisha prophesied in song, presumably in a spontaneous manner, since no mention of rehearsal is made in there. In the Middle Ages, the Kabbalah fostered the idea in synagogue singing, especially among the Ashkenaz, of kavanah, and the Encyclopedia Judaica describes it this way: the intention or concentration on the mystical union of the world and Creator, to be brought about by contemplating the hidden sense behind the plain meaning of the words. Indeed, this unity of Creator and world associated with Torah had been observed by Philo, who once wrote this: "For the entire Torah seems to these people, the Jews, something akin to a living being. The literal sense is the body, while the soul is the secret sense underlying the hidden world." Early Christian writers also associated melody with the role of revelation. The Epistula ad Marcellinum, a 4th century Alexandrian document, says of psalmody, "Just as we make known and signify the thoughts of the soul through the words we express, so too the Lord wished the melody of the words to be a sign of the spiritual harmony of the soul." How this way of thinking about music got lost in the rise of European tonal harmony, rigorous meters and bar lines, large choirs and orchestras, and fragmented text setting. For example, in an Alleluia where you sing ah for 4 or 5 pages. All of that culminating in the elaborately crafted Viennese masses about an impersonal God, as we described with Bruckner earlier, is a story too complex to relate here. My theological point, however, is that just at the time when Schoenberg was coming to realize that God reveals prophecy through organic ideas of composers, Karl Barth, drawing especially on Schleiermacher, was simultaneously reshaping the descriptions of several points of Christian doctrine with metaphors about organic and directed motion. For example, the dualism between Adam and Christ, found in Romans chapter 5, 12 to 21, was given Barth's treatment in his 1921 commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans. We have the commentary in English of 1933 by Edwin C. Hoskins. Previous to Barth, the relation between Adam and Christ had been, quoting Barth, misunderstood as an equilibrium, if I could do my hands this way, resulting from two equal forces operating in opposite directions, or as the movement of the pendulum of a clock. Barth's new idea, which was likened by Karl Adam to, quote, the falling of a bomb on the playground of the theologians, replaced this equilibrium with a directed force of motion from Adam to Christ. And here's Barth's statement. The dualism between Adam and Christ exists only insofar as it dissolves itself. It is a dualism of one movement, of one apprehension, of one road, from here to there. The two contrasted factors are living and true because they point in the same direction. This unity of direction is necessitated by an identity of origin and purpose. Both have their origin and purpose in God, and to him they point. This unity of direction, adhering to figures on earth, whether the figures are Barth's Adam and Christ or Schoenberg's God and composer, is a dynamic motion, the sign of life. It is a Judaic drive to a goal and not a Hellenistic helix of cyclic returns. Nor can we say it's the symmetrical periods of balanced musical phraseology in the Viennese classics. This motion enlivens soteriology when it moves from Adam to Christ, and it enlivens the organic musical idea when it moves from the Most High to Schoenberg's composer. Here's Barth again. Life in Adam and life in Christ is not an ever-recurring cycle of sin and righteousness, death and life. There is unity of movement, but it is displayed in the advantage of the second over the first. The second is Christ, the first is Adam. In the turning from the first to the second, and in the victory of the second over the first. Schoenberg saw this hierarchical, goal-seeking movement in musical tone relations, and he saw it in the relation of composer to God. Speaking musically, in describing the relation of the tonic and dominant triads, for example, Schoenberg wrote this in his theory of harmony. The tonic is the governor of the key or tonality, and the dominant is the governed. The name dominant is usually justified by saying that the first degree appears by virtue of the fifth degree. The first would then be a result of the fifth. But it is not possible that something can be the cause of the phenomenon and simultaneously the effect of the same phenomenon. And note that this compares to the equilibrium that Barth disallowed between Adam and Christ. And there are Schoenberg's own labels for primary and subordinate themes in his music, Hauptstimme and Nebenstimme, the head voice or melody, and the subordinate one. Following now are some further comments by Barth on Romans 5, 12 to 21 that resemble the way Schoenberg described tonal relations or the relation between God and composer. First selection. Genuine movement can take place only if the balance between the two be wholly and finally disturbed. Christ is contrasted to Adam as the goal and purpose of the movement. And another one. Religion is the ability of men to receive and retain an impress of God's revelation. It is the capacity to reproduce and give visible expression to the transformation of the old into the new man, so that it becomes a conscious human expression and a conscious and creative human activity. The law has its invisible foundation and meaning from God, and we are bound to search it out. The second of these two statements could just as well have been written by Schoenberg in reference to the idea in musical composition. It especially recalls Schoenberg's statement given above that, quote, my personal feeling is that music conveys a prophetic message revealing a higher form of life to which mankind evolves. And it also recalls that Schoenberg's musical ideas receive as inspiration and then refined by craft, not constructed measure by measure. In regards to the wholeness and completeness of the organism that is a musical idea, however ambiguous or unrefined by craft, Schoenberg left this anecdote. A few years ago, and he means before 1923, which is the year the 12-tone method solidified, I was deeply ashamed when I discovered in several Schubert songs well known to me that I had absolutely no idea what was going on in the poems. But when I read the poems, it became clear to me that I had gained nothing for understanding of the songs. Without knowing the poem, I had grasped the content, the real content, perhaps even more profoundly than if I had clung to the surface of the mere words expressed. For me, even more decisive than this experience was the fact that, inspired by the sound of the first words of the text, I had composed many of my own songs, straight through to the end, without troubling myself in the slightest about the continuation of the poetic events. In the ecstasy of composing, I had never done greater justice to the poet than when, guided by my first direct contact with the sound of the beginning of the poem, I divined everything that obviously had to follow. The conversion of a perceived idea into a finished, notated, performable musical composition requires craft. For Schoenberg, the preservation of classical techniques, especially those oriented to melody such as fugue, and these are the techniques of Zechter that we discussed before, was necessary, quote, for making the ideas comprehensible to the listener, while at the same time giving the composer a framework for, quote, the emancipation of dissonance. And this emancipation was not for the freedom of the composer's self-expression, as is often thought in contemporary art, but that the composer might respond in any way to the divinely revealed idea. For as Schoenberg also said, art is born of, quote, I must, not I can, like a craftsman can, quote, end quote. No wonder that Schoenberg often spoke of the miraculous contributions of the subconscious, and that in the works of the great masters, many miracles can be discovered, the extreme profundity and prophetic foresight of which seems superhuman. Schoenberg wrote this in 1923 as an introduction to his own analysis of his aforementioned 1906 work, Kammer Symphony, the Chamber Symphony, which, he also says, unveiled the hidden relationship between two main themes. Schoenberg was, in his own words, a conservative who was forced to become radical, at the very time that Vienna itself was a mixture of the conservative and radical, of convention and revolt. He is best known for the radical 12-tone method. He is not known for the conservative aspects of his creative thought that Newlin emphasized, or is he well known for his aim to, quote, restore to style and form the organic cohesion that had been deteriorating. Barth unwittingly describes Schoenberg in his little treatise on Mozart. This is a book he wrote in 1956 on Mozart's bicentenary, and it's fairly well known even in the theological world. I'm going to read you a quote from the English version of it here. And remember, this is 1956. This is Barth on Mozart, but we're going to think Schoenberg. What occurs in Mozart, thinks Schoenberg, is rather a glorious upsetting of the balance, a turning in which the light rises and the shadows fall, a contest to be won. Actually, it is already won. This fact gives it its direction and character. We will never hear in Mozart an equilibrium of forces and a consequent uncertainty and doubt. I now want to go to the musical example. This was written in 1947 when the facts of the Holocaust were coming to public attention, and Schoenberg was moved to write this partly as a call to preservation of Judaism. But in it, all these key ideas of half-conscious, buried in the past, dimly perceived, come about. The narrator is autobiographical. One of the resistance fighters in Warsaw in 1943. They're discovered hiding out in sewers. They're marched off to the gas chambers. Some are too weak to make it, and they're clubbed to death with the rifle butts. And one of the soldiers says they're all dead. So they continue to march on. That sets up a 4-beat rhythm, which in the hearts and minds of these Jews laying on the ground makes them spring back to life. And they sing an old synagogue chant, Deuteronomy 6:4, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, and know. The whole thing is 6 minutes, and it's entirely in 12 tones. A Survivor from Warsaw demonstrates the major elements in Schoenberg's musical style: brevity, compactness, bold expression, melody, and dissonance, all present in the traditional forms of classical Vienna: choir, orchestra, cantata, and a systematic tonal language, whether it be 12-tone or major minor. The driving force of this style work is the theological revelation revealed as an idea to the composer, who then prepares it for the many, who receive it as if, as was said in cantata, prearranged. For in truth, the idea had laid hidden in them also, waiting for the time for prophetically proclaiming the dissonance between God's message and a world comfortably reposed in the idolatry of a self-crafted complacency. Thank you.